So in this video, I'm going to talk about the first major repair I conducted on the R107, which was to the lower chassis leg on the driver's side. So I could tell that the seam between the inner wing and the chassis leg was in quite poor condition. Water had obviously got into the top of the seam and started rusting out the flange of the inner wing. Someone had also put this rather large and crude looking metal patch that was just tacked in place on the side of the chassis leg, which I assume was hiding something rather nasty. And there was also this hole in the side of the chassis leg where approximately 2 mil of metal had just disappeared. And when I took off the rubber grommet that's in the bottom of the chassis leg, I was here for ages with a hoover just pulling flaky rust out in there. Like there was a huge amount of rust trapped in the leg. So I could tell at this point this was going to have to be a major repair to bring that leg back to strength. So the first thing I did was to cut off this rather silly plate that had been put on the side of the leg. I used my Proxen mini angle grinder and the tacks came off really easily, and surprise surprise, when I peeled it back it revealed the rather nasty hole behind it. So the other thing I noticed was that the drain hole, which should be approximately where that red circle is, the drain hole between the chassis leg and the inner wing that just sits in the flange there, had been lost at some point. I could just see a tiny indication of where it once was, but certainly between the flange underneath rusting out, that plate being stuck over, which had a certain amount of filler around it, water was not escaping from this cavity behind the headlamp bowl, and it was just slowly seeping into the seam underneath the chassis leg and just rusting it out from the inside. So I knew part of the work on rebuilding the flange later on the inner wing would have to reinstate that drain hole. So I started to cut around this hole so that I could weld in some new metal. It quickly became apparent, though, that this hole was going to gradually get larger and larger, and eventually we ended up with something like this. So this was about halfway through, having welded in one piece of new metal and then ground it all down with a flap disc. I'd also obviously cut away the rest of the flange from the inner wing. So normally there'd be a flange piece that would come down from the inner wing and would be spot welded to the top of the chassis leg there. I'd obviously cut that away to get better access to the top of the leg. So this was the outside of the chassis leg all finished and flap disc down. While the side had been open, I'd also taken the opportunity to weld up some of the holes on the inside of the leg. For example, there was one just kind of inside the anti-roll bar bracket. Unfortunately, there were more horrors awaiting me on the inside of the leg, which is what I turned my attention to next. So before starting work on the inside of the chassis leg, I had to take the radiator out, which revealed what we see here, which is the bottom of the radiator bracket on the inside, which is spot welded via a little bracket to the inside of the chassis leg. It was obviously very rusty, and what I ended up doing was cutting the bottom half of the bracket off and fabricating a new piece before then being able to go behind it and start work on the chassis leg itself. So this is the sort of thing I was confronted with once having cut that lower radiator bracket out. About half the inner chassis leg between the anti-roll bar bracket at the front, and the front cross member had just completely gone. So I just started cutting out the entire inside of the chassis leg. So I went over some of the pry welds from the outside, I should add, just to make sure that they were all round, and then I gave the inside the inside of the leg, while the inside wall was open, a good coating of Eastwood rust encapsulator to try and prevent any sort of further sort of rusting from the inside out. I then started fabricating a bracket, essentially a new bracket for the lower radiator. So in order to make the replacement lower part of the bracket, I basically cut it in half and fashioned a new piece of metal. I just created the bends using my basic Clark bender and then welded it. So I'm by no means the most skilled fabricator, but after a little bit of welding and grinding, welding, grinding again, it came out all right actually. And of course, once it's actually in situ, no one's really going to see the inside of it anyway. So having welded up the inside of the chassis leg, I then just had to reattach. There's two little brackets you can see just to the left of the hole in the chassis leg down there. One is for the bottom of the radiator mount itself. The other holds, there's a sort of diagonal cross brace that goes in front of the radiator as well, and there's a captive nut on the back of the forward bracket that just bolts on there. But once those two were back in situ, I could then slot the new lower piece for the radiator mount back into place. So having done all that on the inside of the leg, I then moved back round to the outside of the leg. So I'd welded up the side of the leg, all the holes in that earlier on, but I hadn't yet reattached the flange that runs along the bottom of the inner wing, or indeed reinstated the drain hole that had obviously been lost years previously. So I then just had to weld this new flange all the way along the bottom of the inner wing, and then plug weld that flange to the outside of the chassis leg. So I started by looking at recreating the flange behind the bumper bracket back to where the drain hole at the bottom of the inner wing is, so just very basic paper template. Then moved on to a metal piece and offered that up to the bottom of the inner wing, welded that into place. Didn't look pretty initially, but we sort of got there eventually. And then after a bit of grinding off, it was starting to look pretty good actually. Obviously a bit of finishing is still required. And then continued on the other side of where the drain hole is going to be to recreate the bit from there down to the drain hole at the lowest point of the inner wing. And this is after having attached the sort of second part of the flange, welded it up, ground down some of the welds. That hole in the flange is just where I was starting to plug weld back to the chassis leg. Quite a big hole, just to make absolutely sure I got decent penetration through to the leg behind it, which I'm pretty sure I did. And then from then on, it was just a question of cleaning up the rest of the seam welds at the bottom of the wing, and also recreating the little lip for the drainage channel. So my next action was to take the rapid strip disc on the angle grinder and remove all the short-term primers and paints that I'd used to protect the repaired area back to clean metal in preparation for a more permanent 2-pack epoxy mastic product that would provide good future rust protection. So Rustbusters EM121
seemed like one of the best all-round epoxy surfaces to seal the repair, particularly to protect the seam between the inner wing and the chassis leg. It's quite a thick product, so finds its way into different nooks and crannies and will fill some surface imperfections and pitting. I knew that particularly when brushed on, it would not leave a completely smooth finish, but since this area is not readily visible when the outer wing and the wheels are on the car, I felt function was more important and that EM121 would provide better protection than a conventional lower viscosity epoxy primer and top coat. So some areas of the metal I thought would benefit from it, I just went over with a bit of 180 grit sandpaper and then cleaned it off carefully with some Eastwood pre-paint prep. So another reason I'd chosen EM121 was that it seemed to be quite tolerant of being applied in cold and relatively high humidity conditions. So Rustbuster's main condition for the product was that the temperature was no lower than 0 of the steel, and that the steel had to be 3 degrees above the current dew point. So with a temperature of 6 degrees and a relative humidity of about 72%, I was just about within those parameters for application. So it goes on rather like a thick oil paint, and it kind of lends itself to going on with a brush. I didn't thin the product at all. You can thin it, particularly if you're spraying it. It can be sprayed through a spray gun or applied with a roller. I did think about using a roller as well, but given the complexity of the shape and all the crevices that I had to get the product into, I thought a brush was the best option in this instance, and it went on quite nicely. It was quite satisfying to paint, actually. So for the time being, I just brushed the product with a slight overlap up to the existing factory underseal. I still haven't decided whether I'm going to strip all of the underseal off the inner wing eventually. I may or may not. It's quite a lot of work considering how thick it is, and in areas where it's still got its original integrity and there's no rust, I'm perhaps inclined to leave it, but we'll see. That's a decision for a later date. So this is the view from inside the inner wing, looking down at the seam with the chassis leg. So I got as much of the product as possible into the seam to stop water from getting in there and rusting it out in the future. I will put a urethane seam sealer over the top of it as well. And just in case you're wondering, the drain hole is there, and I did check to make sure I hadn't blocked it up in the process of applying the product. So just to backtrack momentarily and talk about preventing future rust inside the chassis leg, while the side of the leg was open, I sprayed as much dinitrol rust converter inside as possible. I then covered that with Eastwood rust encapsulator, and then I went over that again once the leg was fully welded up, using a long flexible hose with an omnidirectional spray pattern on the end, and just sprayed the encapsulator through the different apertures in the leg. So I'm going to leave it here for this video. Hope you've enjoyed watching. The EM121 is currently curing on the car, and I'm going to leave it for a good few days before doing any sanding or adding any fillers if required or anything like that. I'll report back in the future as to what the finished article looked like. In the meantime, stay tuned for more R107 restoration.